Everybody, how's it going? Andrew here. And I just wanted to say real quick, if you could do me a huge favor, and all of us here on the Indie Game Movement podcast, and that is just to write a review or rate the show. One of the two, whatever works for you. It would mean the world to us. That information, the review, the feedback, so helpful to know if we're on the right track, if we're doing things that you really like about this show, if we're covering the right content, the right guests, whatever it may be, all that's helpful. Not only that, the reviews, the ratings, those are all helpful in terms of discoverability so we can do better on the platforms that we're on, wherever you're listening. If you could just take a moment, write a review, it would absolutely mean the world to us, and just a small little way that you can help and do your part as a listener to make sure other people are finding out about the podcast, are learning, and getting the great, helpful content that you are also receiving just by listening. So again, take a moment, whenever you can, write a review, rate the show. It would mean the world to us. So thank you so much for being such great listeners. And now let's get right to the show.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about understanding user behavior and maximizing player retention. Now, retaining players for any game is a constant challenge. And while it's an ongoing obstacle many of us face, sometimes having a better understanding of players can go a long way. So join us today as we delve into the realm of user behavior, exploring strategies to captivate and maximize player retention, and discover how understanding player psychology and implementing effective engagement tactics can transform indie games into lasting experiences that keep players coming back for more. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Patrick Rose. Patrick, how's it going? And thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, sure. It's going well. And hello from Korea. I'm currently in Korea, traveling around, something like a digital nomad, maybe you could say. And I just enjoyed over here. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here, especially making the time, because from what I understand, it's pretty late in the evening where you are in Korea, where it's morning for me. So again, appreciate you making the time. Now, folks, for those of you who aren't familiar, Patrick Rose is a product and strategy games consultant. I mean, he dives into everything from game design, user behavior, and psychology, just to name a few. There's a lot of other areas he dives into as well. And some of which we're going to get into and talk about a lot more for today's subject, as I mentioned in the introduction. But in addition to that, he's also the co-founder of Leak and Ribs Games, Gamigo Group. Has done the head of product management there, has worked at Bandai Namco as a business and product analysis. I mean, he has done so many different things, lots of experience and expertise. In this background, everything from like research and I mean, there's just so much there that you have going for you. But in addition to that, I mean, you've worked on past projects like games and stuff like Dark Souls, Elden Ring, Dragon Ball, One Piece, Tekken, Little Nightmares. The list really goes on. So just lots of experience. And also there's an organization I'm curious to learn a little bit more about called Mighty Diamonds. It's a free collective of game consultants. Can you share a little bit more about that and your involvement with that organization?
Yeah, sure. So usually I'm more like a freelance business product guy and help with game design and so on. However, we are at the Mighty Diamonds. We are a group of consultants. We are all like freelancers. We all have our own businesses, but we also support each other. And also as a group, as a free collective, basically, we try to help indie studios out there and also bigger studios. And well, just trying our best to serve the games industry as good as we can.
Awesome. And it's always great to hear and learn about these types of communities out there that are really doing what they can to not just help the industry, but especially the indie dev industry as well. So great to hear your involvement with that. And in terms of like just other acknowledgments and things, I mean, you have spoke at like numerous different conferences. One of the most recent ones, I guess, looking back was the Nordic Game Conference in 2023, where you're talking about pitch coaching workshop for indie studios. And you're also going to be at Nordic Games again this year, which is coming up, correct?
Yes, exactly. So the event last year where I did the pitch coaching for indie studios, that was a smaller event, a side event of the Nordic Game. And this year in May, there will be the very big event in Malmö in Sweden, which is one of the biggest gaming events in the north of Europe. And well, I will go there together with a group of the Mighty Diamonds I mentioned before. And we will actually be there to support indie studios and all sizes of studios with our work there. And you can even, if you wanted so, you could even hire us for free there for like a short session. We might have a look at your game. We might give you a little bit of feedback. Of course, we are only like 8 people there, so we won't have time for everyone. Be quick using the meet to match system there at the Nordic Game. And you can meet us. You can even directly book me, and I can give you input on your game, for example, on your pitch or on your game design, monetization. Any of these topics I usually support people with entirely for free. This is how we partner up with the Nordic Game this year.
That's awesome and great to hear. So, folks, if you happen to be attending Nordic Games, the conference this year, definitely make sure to, check out what Mighty Diamonds is doing. You could probably reach out to Patrick directly as well, or even others that are part of that group to really take advantage of this support that they're offering the communities. So, again, thank you for doing that. That's really awesome. And one last thing that I'm a little bit curious about, what you're doing so much when you're not dialed in, plugged into all these great things that you're doing. What are some things that you do in your free time? And there's one in particular I see in my notes here that is, I think, really interesting. So what's a hobby you do to kind of maybe not necessarily relax, but maybe it is relaxing for you? But what is that?
A nice one. Yes, I love climbing. So maybe you know about climbing a little bit, maybe you don't. And there's that subcategory, which is bouldering, which is climbing without a rope, but it's not too high. It's only up to 4 meters and stuff. And that bouldering is all about solving problems. And like the routes are literally called problems. So, and this is the big fun of it, solving that puzzle in front of you, not only with your body, but also with your mind, because it's also about like fighting your anxiety, you're being scared when you're up there, right? And you need to find your focus in difficult situations. And I love that stuff. This is really taking me to another place, make me focus again, make me just being with myself again. And I even do that over here in Korea, like every second day or so, I go to the climbing gyms and hang out with the Koreans here.
That's awesome to hear. And I love that. And yeah, you're right. I think I knew that at one point in time where the roots are actually called problems and you are literally solving problems, but different contexts. But I think the concept is essentially the same, right? I mean, you could apply it in any different way. And the fact that it's a puzzle, it is a puzzle, just a very different kind of puzzle. So, and knowing that, I would have to just, if you're ever in this part of, the Northeast in the US, I humbly invite you to maybe come down to my neck of the woods, because there is a state park called Pawtuckaway Park, and they have a whole section called Boulder Field, and there's people there like every weekend doing exactly what you're doing. Giant, huge boulders. It's a lot of fun. I haven't done it myself, but it seems like everybody there is having a lot of fun. So just something to keep in mind. I'm sorry, folks, I digress, but I just had to share that with Patrick. So, Patrick, thank you for sharing all that, information about you. But you know what? I want to get to know you a little bit more. I think we all do. So we're going to put you in the Q box round. And folks, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a few random questions I prepared here for Patrick today. So, Patrick, are you ready for the Q box round?
I am ready.
All right. I love this. This works out so well, but what's your main approach to tackling problems? And not necessarily roots, but maybe it's an analogy there. I don't know. We'll find out.
It is. It absolutely is. Problems. Yeah, nobody likes them apparently, but actually I do. I like them not only when I'm bouldering, but also in real life. If people have problems, it means there's a potential solution to that. So one of my former bosses, he used to say, there are no problems, actually. There's only solutions. And I kind of like that mindset, like this positive attitude towards problems. You don't look for a problem. I don't want to hear problems at work. I want to hear the solutions. So when I'm a leader, for example, I ask people not for the problems, but for the solutions. That's a really important thing, I believe. When there's a problem, when people have a problem, the nice thing about it is you can solve them. And people with that problem will pay you money for that. So it's an entrepreneur mindset to actually look for problems and solve them and make money with that. So if there are problems, that's a good thing. This is one of the most important things, I believe, if it comes to tackling problems. Having that positive mindset, seeing it as a challenge, just like when I'm bouldering, I see the problem in front of me and I want to solve it. I want to understand how I can overcome it. And then it feels really rewarding if I was actually able to do so.
Yeah, I absolutely love that concept too, because I think sometimes we get caught in the idea of just the problem itself, but not looking at it from a solution perspective. And think about it, you're like, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, but let's just go back to the bouldering one. I mean, you have these problems, right? And what's the goal? To get to the top, to accomplish something. And that's fulfilling, right? But if you just look at the problem and just don't think of a way to solve that problem or whatever's obstacles in your way, then how are you going to get to that top? Right? How are you going to succeed at what you're looking to accomplish? And I mean, you might be able to, but I think it's going to be a lot harder if you don't approach it that way. So love that concept. All right. Number 2, what's your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Oh my God. There's so many actually, and so hard to name that one thing. But recently it's definitely, well, let me mention 3 examples if I may. So one of them is the overuse of, is it called rhombus shapes in UIs? Rhombus is the English term for these like squares, but you like rotate them by 45 degrees. That's a rhombus, right?
Yeah, it's like, or a lack of a better term, like it would be a simple diamond, right? If you just have like 4 sides. Yeah.
Exactly, these diamonds.
But rhombus is correct. Rhombus is correct. But.
Well, thank you. I like to be correct. Right, and you use, I'm sorry, you will not be able to unsee this from now on, but you see them everywhere in so many games in the recent years. And it's horrible. I think one of the first games doing that was like Assassin's Creed, the early Assassin's Creed games, and that was fine. It looked really cool at that time. It's awesome. They do look cool. But now I see them in all type of games, even in Final Fantasy, in indie games, everywhere I see them. I don't want them anymore. Second thing I see everywhere now is grappling hooks. They don't even make sense. Try to use a grappling hook like all these ninjas and samurais, or even the Master Chief is doing now. Try that in real life, mid-air, using the grappling hook, and then trying to pull yourself towards something, right? It will rip off your arm. That's not going to work. It's not going to work. Not at all. This is, to me, a little bit of a immersion break, to be honest. And then the third thing is bad tutorials in AAA games. How is it possible that all the free-to-play games so many people hate out there because they have bad monetization and so on, or they are just not real games or anything like this? How can it be that these have much better tutorials than AAA games these days? AAA games throw the text boxes in your face. I feel like I have to read a book first before I can get to play that game. There are better ways to design tutorials, even if you have a complex game, and I cannot see that anymore.
You know, I think it's funny you bring this up, only because, I mean, I come across this too sometimes, but it's been a while, honestly, since I played a AAA game, at least a recent one, or anything fairly recent. And but now that you call out to, I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I mean, there's lots of discussions and talks about this, and there's lots of people, especially in the indie space, that are finding really creative and effective ways to
Yeah.
addressing this. But the fact that it still happens, just I can totally see your point on that. So cool. All right, and last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Well, I must say, since now I'm in full travel mode, it's a little bit more difficult to play games for me. But I have been spending the past 12 months in Germany, and I've been playing a lot of games at that time. And just recently, I've been playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake again. I've played it before. Final Fantasy VII, the original one, is my favorite game of all time, by the way. Only to prepare for Rebirth, but I was not able to start Rebirth yet, and I know it's a sin, but I'm going to play it in summer. When I'm back to Germany, I will play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and also Baldur's Gate 3. I'm still on that one, and that game is massive. It's going to take me 5 years to finish that.
Well, that's a better rate than what I'm at, because my track record is horrible. Like, I think I'm halfway through Remake. I just pulled out 15 because I was trying to get my kids to watch some different show. I'm like, oh, I got the deluxe. I'll share that's a cool movie. The fact that it came with the game, and then I'm like, oh wait, I need to play this more too. Anyways, it's but so I don't think 5 years is a bad track record, at least compared to what mine is, which is atrocious. But that's okay, as long as we're playing games and we're enjoying it. That's all that matters. So awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, Patrick, thank you for allowing us to put you through the cue box round. But now we're going to get to the heart of our conversation today, which is, understanding user behavior and maximizing player retention. Because these are two really important things that, not only do we need to do our best to get into, but just they inform us on so much, right? So to kick things off, player retention is a crucial aspect of any game success. So I'm curious, how do you define what player retention is, and why is it so important for indie game developers?
Right. So what is player retention? Basically, it just means players are actually playing your game and you want them to play it for a long time. So engagement is a really important thing, because you need to engage your players first so they stick with your game. Play it as much as possible, maybe every day, maybe for several weeks or months. It's not really necessarily important for every game that people play it for many months, especially premium games that are not necessarily service games, maybe solo game experiences. It's enough if people just finish the game or just buy the game, then you got your money already. But it's still a good idea to have a little bit of player retention, also to keep them in your portfolio, right? So it's all about engagement in the end. So about motivating people to play the game. And it is absolutely one of the main success factors for all type of games, basically, especially for service games, obviously. And also you want to keep people in your portfolio and follow your company for a long time, maybe for your next game and so on. And something that is really important to understand is also that you can measure retention fairly easily, actually. Some typical retention metrics and KPIs are something like day one retention, so how many people still play the game on after 24 hours, maybe how many people stay after 1 week or come back after 1 week or something like that, like day 7 retention, day 30 retention, these kind of KPIs. Playtime, or how many play sessions per day. This is how you would measure retention usually.
Great insights there. One, I want to dive into a little bit more. Now, you called out to kind of standalone, premium product and game as a service, right? Obviously, the retention aspect makes a lot of sense from games as a service, but from those standalone products, those premium products, I mean, you called out to saying, hey, it's great, they can buy your game, and that could be the end of it, and you get money for that, awesome. But and some people might think of that okay, well, what does the retention really? Why is this still important? If they bought the game, great. But why is it still important? Because if they just buy the game and then it just sits in their library forever, why is that not necessarily a good thing? And as it relates to player retention?
Right. So that is a really good question. And honestly, for a lot of AAA game makers, sometimes it feels to me that they don't care about retention at all. And this is why the thing I mentioned before, like the bad tutorials. In a free-to-play game, you cannot do that. You cannot have a bad tutorial, because if you have a bad tutorial, people will leave immediately. Your day one retention will be horrible. People only stay in these AAA games because they have already paid $60, $70, $80 for that game to play it, right? They come in with a pretty big engagement already, and they have made that investment already. But then again, a lot of people don't play very long. They play only for 1 or 2 hours, and then they stop playing, and the game will hit their pile of shame, right? So it is true. It is not that necessarily that important to create that retention through the actual gameplay for these AAA premium games. However, that is also kind of a short-term, short-sighted perspective, I believe, because you might want to have a company strategy, a portfolio strategy. Maybe you want to add DLCs to your game. Imagine people play Final Fantasy 16, but only 20% of these people finish it. And then there's a DLC releasing. It's going to release soon, the Final Fantasy 16 DLC. And only these 20% are the actual remaining audience who might be interested purchasing the DLC as well, because the rest of them haven't even finished the game. So even for these games, it is important to, well, keep people engaged so that they actually finish the game at least, or maybe even play it twice or something. One other thing you want to consider is you want people to create content about your game. And people will create content about your game when they are very engaged about it, meaning, YouTube content, for example. So things become a little more viral, you get more organic users in, and so on. So if you're not able to make people finish your game even, then there's also less surface area for content, basically.
Yeah.
So all these things make it important for also AAA, or let's say premium games. Doesn't need to be AAA, can also be indie games, but premium games to focus on retention mechanics.
Yeah. And I love that, because earlier too, you mentioned, the importance of what that does to your portfolio, your studio's audience, right? If you're building up this audience, that the retention is a form of like, hey, we can go back to this audience with the next project, whether it be another premium product, DLC, but also I think a great way to just simplify it is retention equals long tail. If people are creating content, if people are playing this game for a while and be like, I love this game this much, and they start sharing it with their friends. These are all kind of long tail things that at a certain point, it might be hard to attribute what's happening, but you can still see from those actions of how it's actually overall contributing because of that retention, because that retention ultimately equates to a better long tail. So I love how you called out those things, because it is important. And we can't just say, hey, great, we got your money and we're good, because if it just sits on a shelf, the game isn't doing everything that I think it should be designed to do. Because sometimes we might forget that's the end of the stage, but there's there's still life after. It's just not as maybe exciting as it is ramping up to that launch.
So, absolutely.
All right. I want to get into a little bit more about user behavior and even the psychology, because this is a stuff that I think is kind of not only subjective, but it's not as tangible as I think all of us would like it to be. So to start off with that area, what would you say are some common challenges indie game developers face when it comes to retaining players? And how can, let's say, understanding their behavior help overcome some of these challenges?
Right. I think one of the biggest obstacles a lot of indie developers are facing without even noticing that it's there is the accessibility of their games. It is something heavily underestimated. It's something almost invisible. And I'm not talking about invisibility for like, how do you say that correct, politically correct in English these days?
Just disabled, like there's like some type of disability that like maybe controller support, exactly. Or if they're colorblind, or like those types of things. Yeah, because I think that's top of mind. You're right. Yep.
Yeah, that is top of mind. And I believe it's a big mistake that this is top of mind, because accessibility, usability, these kind of things are really, really important for everyone. That means we are all, or many of us have like full-time jobs. Maybe we only have maybe time to play video games in the evening. Also, we have to feed our kids or take care of our family or whatever. We don't have much. Many of us don't have much time to play games anymore, but they still love games. So these people also need your game to be accessible, so they can just easily pick it up at any time, even though they don't have much time, or they can even play it at work. Some games you can just play at work, literally, talking about mobile games especially. While you're working on the side, you also play a game, super high accessibility. And that also means people play your game. They are engaged, that your game engages them, and there's also going to be retention, obviously, as a result of that. So accessibility is something you need to consider. And this is also leading us back again to tutorials, onboarding situations. You need to make these things accessible for people. Also, you want to consider your pricing if it comes to accessibility. You want to consider, do you even have a start screen in the beginning of the game, or do you skip that right away and people just jump right into the gameplay or anything like this? So this is all accessibility. What platform can they play it on? How can they play it? How easy is it to play it? And I'm not saying you should make a casual game or dumbing your game down or anything. Your game can still be super, super complex, like Zelda, the recent Zelda games, Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild. They are highly accessible games, but they are also very complex games, right?
Yeah, no,
I do have.
Keep going. I want you to go more. if you have more, that's great.
Yeah, I have a lot on that topic. So sorry for talking so much, but this is also what I'm here for, right? So deal with it.
Love it.
So not enough focus on metagame is a really important thing as well. And especially social features. So metagame, you often hear that term when we talk about service games or when we talk about free-to-play games. That is all that like gameplay that happens on a higher level, more strategic, more long-term focused gameplay and so on. That is also crew features or clan features or these kind of things. Socializing with other people. Socializing really keeps people in the game for a very, very long time and can be super powerful for retention. And a strong focus on metagame often is more worth than actually on the core game. And I'm a little bit sad about having to say that. But I have seen games with very boring core gameplay that still have great retention metrics just because they have clan features where people always have a common goal, where people always are encouraged to talk with each other and people keep coming back just for the group, for example. So however, all this metagame and also the core gameplay doesn't matter. That is all based on psychology in the end, on motivation. Motivation is the key word. You want to understand human intrinsic motivation specifically. And that, if you understand how to create or how to trigger motivation in humans, then you understand how to make engaging gameplay, and that will keep the players also engaged for a very long time. Understanding this, and that answers your question, I think, understanding the psychology behind that and user behavior behind that will help overcoming these challenges for indie studios.
You know, I love that you called out on these two main things. The accessibility for one, I agree. Lots of times when we hear this, we think about, controllers, the things we mentioned earlier. But accessibility, I think at its core, really comes down to having empathy for your players. Like, I mean, a big thing, I just got back from GDC last week, and a big thing a lot of people from what I met with, where everybody was talking about, hey, people can play these games, have these experiences in bite-sized pieces. There's still a lot of game, but it's 15 minutes because people are busy. More and more people are getting in tune to this, which I think is great. But we also have to look beyond that too. That's important, but what are the other factors? And you list some really great examples there in terms of what does that look like? What else? For me personally, some examples are, I'm a big RPG fan. I really have not gotten that far in, but Dragon Quest XI. But one of the
Right.
features I noticed about that game, I would consider an accessibility one, was anytime I was out for a long period of time, and folks, this could be 6 months before I tap into this game again, the description where I left off to remind me where I am in the gameplay, and it gives you a quick synopsis. It was like, if it's a short period of time, it changes. If it's a long period of time, it changes. So I can actually recollect and understand exactly where I am. So I'm not missing a beat from a period of 6 months. Now, RPGs, they can't structure things in little, like, as other games, in these little segments of like 15, half an hour, maybe hour gameplay sessions. But because of that one feature, it makes it extremely accessible and more likely for someone like me to get back into that game. And in a way, that's a form of user retention, right?
Exactly.
And another thing I want to call out, the metagame and the socializing aspect. I mean, that's important, especially depending on, hey, if your audience consists of player types that are big time socializers, that's a great thing. And you're talking about different forms of engagement. And a quick analogy I was thinking of as you were saying that is, like, think about Facebook. It's not a game, but for some people it may be. And what's their objective? I think part of the reasons why Facebook is so smart and successful up until, I guess, now, because, you know, things are always changing and the user base isn't quite the same as what it used to be. But by design, it's a social platform. It's keeping people there. If you're running ads or doing something and you want people off site, you're not as rewarded as if you're keeping them within that platform. And they know that. And because of the socializing aspect of it, I mean, that's just not a game related, but very similar. But the reason I'm sharing that, because it goes back into the psychology that you were just mentioning about. Like, there are other elements outside of just game design, which can also be incorporated into the game itself, that really contribute to these things that we're talking about from the psychology standpoint, from the from the design and user behavior aspect. And we'll go into the next question in a minute, but I want a quick question for you. Are you familiar with the book Hooked by Nir Eyal? Oh my goodness, I'm butchering his name right now. I brought it up too. Nir Eyal. Are you familiar with that book at all, Hooked?
Well, I did. I don't think I read that book.
Okay. But I'm only calling it out today, folks, because basically what Patrick was talking about, and what I'm kind of alluding to, it's a really interesting book to check out. I'll put it in the show notes. I'm not going to go into more detail about that, but it's called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. But basically the psychology aspects that Patrick was calling out to is a really good deep dive into those things. So again, I don't want to digress here, but just something I'll throw in the show notes, because what he's talking about here can dive into a little bit more. But speaking of diving into more, why don't we do that too? Because look, I mean, we got some interesting insight here in how to overcome, some of these challenges, but like, how do you go about to understanding these things better? Like, how do you approach analyzing user behavior and psychology to really optimize, player retention for, strategies for indie games?
Right. So how do I approach analyzing user behavior? Usually, I mean, a very typical scenario for me would be that a client asked me that question, right? Our user retention isn't great, Patrick. Please help us out here. What I would usually do is I have two different approaches. I would hope that they are already measuring their user behavior, meaning having the metrics for retention and so on. So all these important key performance indicators. And then I would have a look at them. And depending...
I'm sorry, would these be with like certain tools or like third party like types of tools or resources? Okay, all right, great. And keep going.
Well, some studios develop their own tools to measure their metrics, and that is awesome that they can do so. It gives them much more flexibility, but it's also not everyone has the resources, of course, for this. Especially indie studios don't really have that. Bigger publishers often have their own solutions, or there's also a lot of third-party solutions out there because it's really, really important for a lot of service games out there. And so I would look at these numbers, this data. And then usually depending on what type of game it is, what platform it is on, what genre maybe, but much more important is what kind of gameplay and meta game they have. I would be able to tell already by experience if these retention KPIs are pretty good for this game category or not so well. And then I would look at short-term retention, long-term retention, and so on. So day 1, day 30 retention, also the so-called DAU-MAU ratio, which is daily active users per monthly active users, also called the stickiness factor, these kind of things. I have a look at these things, and depending on what I see there, maybe I think early retention is bad, but the late game retention is actually pretty good in comparison to that, in relation to that. Then I would obviously tackle early retention, and that is the onboarding. I would have a look very closely at the onboarding, understand what kind of steps are being made, what tutorial steps, how many steps are there, how many screens are there, how long is the loading, what happens during the loading screen. All these details are important. For example, if I look at a loading screen and I don't even see any progress, I don't know if the game is loading now or not. Maybe there's just a disk turning like in the old games or something. You don't know how far the game is, or it's getting stuck at 50% or something like that. And it doesn't show you any movement. You could assume that maybe the game crashed. So maybe you will jump out of the game. All these things I would analyze in very, very detail, right? If I have these original indicators. However, often I don't have them. Often I have no idea about the back end, about the numbers. Then I have to go the more like games research path, basically. So I'm also used to be a games researcher, just looking at games, understanding what's happening in them without knowing all that data in the background. And therefore, I would take my client's game. I would simply play it, obviously. And thankfully, on the one hand, by experience, I can already tell what the issues could be. And on the other hand, since I do understand psychology and the most important factors of human intrinsic motivation, I also understand how certain features, early features or late game features, the meta game, will trigger your motivation or will not trigger your motivation. And then I can at least make these qualitative assumptions, and these can be tested then later. I would also make some feature, like some suggestions for changing some mechanics or features maybe, or even entirely new implementations of features. This is then how I help people. So these two ways, either I come directly from the data side, that is often the objectively most effective way, or I will come from the a little more subjective way and just playing the game and understanding what is going on there. And you would be surprised. I'm pretty good at guessing your metrics in your game by just playing it. If I may humbly say so about myself. Well, I'm actually pretty proud of that.
No, and I think you should be. And it says something there too, folks. I mean, Patrick's been doing this for a while, but at the same time, for those of you who may not have some of these resources, can implement your own tools or third-party resources. It's I think a great example in how Patrick shared his process, and in time, you can start picking up on these things too. Again, it's almost like just putting yourself in the player's shoe. I mean, it might be hard. We get tunnel vision when we're working on our own projects, but if you're approaching it from the perspective of, hey, if I'm playing this for the first time, and again, that can be hard to do sometimes, but if you're playing like that and you see that, and ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, but you're looking, regardless if you have the data or not, you're just dialing in and trying to find all those friction points, because the more friction, the less retention, right? And overall, just potentially a poor experience, or less of optimal experience. So I love how what you just outlined is really just, if we were to distill it, it's like, hey, where are these friction points? What's causing players to do this or not do this? And it's really a helpful process. And in light of that, I mean, what would you say are some examples of learning these things and kind of like implementing, learning this, applying it, creating a strategy, and then applying it to a game. And of these examples, what would you say are some effective ways that indie developers can kind of, build up this retention, or even maybe potentially their community? Like, how do these things get implemented from an indie standpoint, and then, support other areas of their game, not just the retention itself?
Right. So the thing is, when we think indie games, we often think they don't have a big budget. They don't really have money to put in nice and fancy features. Maybe they don't have the money for servers, creating a clan feature or anything like that. I'm saying you don't need all these fancy features you see in the big games out there. But you can still get inspired by the big games and have to ask the question, why are these big games in the end? And then learn from them. The why question is really, really important, because when you ask why all the time, why do people play games at all? What is that? What in human nature makes us sit in front of a screen, push some buttons and look at some images moving? Why do we do that for hours a day? Isn't that crazy? And there is answers in our brain. If you get to these answers, if you keep asking and also maybe reading some of the literature out there, I love self-determination theory, for example, by Ryan and Deci. It's a theory about human intrinsic motivation. And that tells you a lot. Then you go back to the big games, analyze these games. And then you will learn a lot, even as an indie developer, on how you can use the psychology in your tiny features. Tiny because maybe you can only make tiny features, because you can only make a tiny game because you don't have so much money. I think to name some examples, I started my career at Good Game Studios. That was our free-to-play browser and mobile game company. They started also as an indie developer, right? So like almost every studio does. And basically they are still an indie developer since they are self-publishing and everything, but they became huge. So when I started there, they were already comparably big, 100 people. Later, they were even more than 1,000 people 3 years later, because they made so much money with understanding psychology. They did a lot of research with their games. Their games aren't especially great, but they made the money. And they knew that people stay in the game for the group. The thing we talked about before, the relatedness factor in self-determination theory, that is, the theory I mentioned before, that is a really powerful factor. I, at that time, was a games researcher, and this is also where I started understanding all these things, because I did that for that company, right? And this is how we use the psychology. We also see a lot of psychology going on, or user behavior methods basically being used in hyper-casual games. I believe even AAA game makers can learn a lot from hyper-casual games, these tiny, annoying games you keep seeing in the app stores, right? Because there's so much micro-psychology happening, so many little things that keep influencing you, and you stick to that tiny, little, stupid game sometimes. Not all of them. Actually, a lot of them are really smart. They just look stupid, but they are really smart. So you can learn a lot from these. And if you know the theory behind that, like what I said, the self-determination theory, you can understand suddenly why these features work on you, as an example. I have made a hyper-casual game myself with two of my friends with a League and Ribs game studio. We have actually tried a whole bunch of hyper-casual games, and I was applying this psychology, right? So Pilot Royale is one of these games. I put a lot of very interesting stuff in, I believe. What we did was, for example, and this is going a little bit into detail now with actual gameplay features. The first match you're playing, Pilot Royale is, you are the pilot of an airplane. One finger controls, very simple one finger 3D airplane controls. That was already really important for me, accessibility. You can play that 3D airplane with only one finger, and you can still do the rolls and flips and everything you can do with an airplane and shooting, all with one finger. And that was the first thing I did for retention, basically the accessibility part. Second part I did was the first match. You will not win, but you will always be on rank 2. Meaning from I think, how many was that? I think 20 airplanes. You will always be rank 2 automatically. So yes, we are tricking the player there, but nobody realizes that. We made sure nobody can really realize that. It makes you feel good enough. First match, rank 2, not bad, but you also feel like there is more room, right? You can improve. There's room for improvement. That is the competence factor in the self-determination theory I was mentioning. That you feel like you did already good, you feel competent, but there's more to learn because we want to learn, we want to develop our brain. That is motivation, intrinsic motivation. We use that. I use it there. Second match, you win. Always, unless you do nothing. But usually you would win, meaning you have improved. This is your direct feedback. You have improved. Competence factor fulfilled. When we implemented this feature like that, this system, we saw the retention KPIs, the metrics improve. Early retention, day one retention went up by, I think, 3-4%, something like that. I don't remember the details. Later, adaptive difficulty. The game will adjust in accordance to your performance. You didn't do so well the past 5 matches, the game will dial down the difficulty. You will become better. Also, the competence factor of self-determination theory. You will always feel good enough, not too good. It's not like too easy. There's always a certain challenge. It always needs to be there, but also not too difficult, right? Not frustrating. Really, really important to keep people motivated. That is retention. And I have a whole bunch of other features like this. I also would say that we have created the very first highly accessible, hyper-casual clan feature in the world. At least I have never seen any other game doing this. I created a clan feature because I know relatedness factor is really important, but at that time in hyper-casual games, you didn't have social features. I created the clan feature. We called it crews because it's pilots. You after 5 matches, you're being pushed into a crew automatically. You don't even have to think about it. You don't even necessarily notice that you're in there, but suddenly you collect some crew points that go into your crew account and you help them without even knowing. You might figure it out subtly, is that a word? Like not actively, but you might figure it out on the fly. Oh, I was helping them and oh, I get a prize for helping them and so on. So the crew kind of thanks me for that. I become part of a group in a highly accessible way that doesn't even bother me at all, but I do something for other people. Relatedness factor. All right, that was a lot of talking now. I understand. But this is one of the best examples I can bring up because this is also what I have designed myself and I've seen the improvement in KPIs right away. And at that time, when we actively were working on that, we had about 3 million downloads with that one on the app stores.
You know, there's so many things to expound on here. I was trying to take some notes and also digressed a little bit too, but here, I'll just call some of these things out. One, I know some people might be thinking about, hey, what you did with the second part, you'll never like completely succeed at that, that part of the game, right? But what was coming to mind too is a little nod, maybe some geekism here, but what the first thing that hit my mind was the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek, the training module, where by design, no one could ever, beat that training module, right? But it was funny because I can't remember if they shared any of the specifics on the show or the movie about it, but you have the data to be like, yeah, but you're more likely to then get better, and then it pushes you more, in which engagement, right? And then there's the like throughout all those conversations too, there was a whole psychology aspect, which I'm going to call it to something important and then want your thoughts out in a minute. But by focusing more so on the psychology and understanding those things, you also shared what was it? You were talking about the human intrinsic motivation aspect of things. And if you understand those things, then it's like, okay, now I can design these experiences that are more focused on positive feedback loops. How do we get players to keep coming back? You mentioned confidence. If players are playing and the game is able to understand by design, and I'm sure in time it could be a lot more dynamic and tools that can be leveraged to pick up on this. a little bit easier for us developers out there. I mean, if you're always incorporating those positive feedback loops and doing so in an ethical way, again, that's more empowerment to the players. It's more positive feedback. It's a better, more fulfilling experience. And what I want to bring this back to and get your thoughts on, I know that the title of this conversation we're having today is about user behavior, but in a way, by you sharing that very detailed example, which I think is great, I think some of us are probably starting to realize that, yes, user behavior is good, but it's not necessarily always about the behavior. It's about understanding the psychology, because the psychology, if you understand that, would probably end up dictating the actual behavior. But it's just, I think, another layer that we don't typically look. And again, I mean, we're focused on making games and things like that. But if you look at it from the perspective of, I understand behavior and concepts around that, but if we take it one step further into the psychological aspect, I mean, and we do so obviously in an ethical way, we can now provide really like even greater experiences for our players. But I just love that approach, because I don't think a lot of us think of it that way from the psychology aspect of it, as much as, you know, again, when we talked about accessibility, what was that surface level thoughts that probably hit most of our minds? But when we're talking about behavior, in a way that, even though it's dialed in a bit more, that still could be surface level. And we're not necessarily diving in that next step further of what that psychology is. So I don't know. I guess any other thoughts about that? I mean, because there are kind of two separate things, but they're not at the same time. It's kind of strange, but I guess it all depends on how you look at it.
Right. So the user behavior is the output
Yes.
of that psychology happening in the background. And psychology also is more like a macro term, actually. It goes deeper than just that. So what I'm talking about here is extrinsic motivation and the macro theory of, intrinsic motivation and the macro theory of human intrinsic motivation. So we are still on the macro level. We can go deeper. I have also been reading up a lot about neuroscience, for example. So like the physiology of the human body, why we do things, where's all that coming from, what do the hormones do on the physiology, on the neuroscience level, basically. And, you know, everyone always mentions dopamine, right? But it's not only dopamine, there's much more to that. I don't know why everyone only focuses about dopamine, on dopamine, because there are many other neurotransmitters in our brains, and it is the mix that lead us to a certain emotion that lead us to a certain user behavior. And that is, for example, we are saying that, oh, I'm having fun with this. Oh, I'm sad about this, or I'm angry, or anything like that. So, however, for game design, usually I would recommend to have the main focus on the macro theory level of the human intrinsic motivation, for example, and also the extrinsic motivation, if you want to go deeper into that topic. But for the simple reason of practicality, because neuroscience is really, really complex. You can go so deep there. And you can only, with video games at least, you can only change so and so much on the neural level directly. But on that macro level, you can change things much more direct. It's, to me, usually I remember three main factors. And two of them I already mentioned. That is the competence factor, the relatedness factor, and the third one is the autonomy factor. It is that simple if you want to understand human intrinsic motivation. And if you base all your game features just on these three factors, you can make extremely engaging games and a lot of things that are still not out there yet. There's so much room for innovation already. If we are done with that, if we really think, okay, now there's nothing to get anymore in this area, the blue ocean is not blue anymore in that intrinsic motivation ocean, then you can go deeper. Then you can really try to tackle the neuroscience and so on. But I usually don't recommend going that deep at this state of the games industry. That is much more sophisticated. Maybe we will be there in 50 years.
I absolutely love it. But again, it sounds like there's still a wealth of information out there within our own projects, within other projects and stuff that we can And to a degree, yes, it will take some time and some resources, I'd imagine. I always like to group time as a resource because too often it's not. But there are means to make this happen and to get to this level of understanding, maybe not quite so deep, but enough to really help and infer important decisions that you make with your development and such. We talked a lot here about some of these strategies, how it can actually be implemented. But to kind of wrap up a little bit, I'm curious and want to know what you shared about everything from behavior and then diving into more of the psychology. How else could, let's say, because we're talking very specifically about game development, but how else can maybe some of these ideas or concepts, I mean, and to the best of your ability, relate further to community engagement, whether it's directly associated with, the meta game side of things, or even beyond, let's say, as it relates to, marketing as a whole in terms of awareness and interacting with your community there. Is there anything we could take from some of these insights and the psychology or behavior aspects that we talked about games that could maybe perhaps influence or help get people excited from an awareness perspective?
Yeah. So the psychology part and human behavior, that obviously works in every field. This is not only game related. And this is also what I love about my job. I'm actually not, I wouldn't even say I'm a games researcher. I'm actually more of a human researcher. I understand how humans work. And therefore, I can also understand how humans work in every kind of life situation. That also includes marketing, for example, and community building, engaging people, and so on. However, I must also say I wouldn't consider myself as a marketing expert, even though I did a few gigs in that direction. But there's probably bigger experts than I am, better experts than I am. And though you can definitely engage the people with the same concepts. I always make a strict separation between the engagement and retention, or the community or player engagement you can drive through the product, which is the game, through the game. And I focus usually on that part. And then you can drive engagement outside of the game. And that is obviously in very different ways. And communication is really, really important there, obviously. Having a brand strategy, having all that marketing in place, your trailers engage. But even there, and this is where I, with the psychology part, often went into I did that a little bit at Bandai Namco, actually, for some of these brands, like how to make the trailers for Elden Ring, for example, and so on. I talked to these managers that were responsible for the marketing in Europe on Elden Ring and some other games from Bandai Namco. And I applied the same things. You can engage people by showing them that they get in your game what they want. And that is, again, these three factors. Relatedness. Relatedness means either socializing with other players. This game has multiplayer, co-op, or anything. Looks super cool. This is how it looks. You should play it. But relatedness can also be your narrative and story, because you are related to these artificial characters. It's not really social. I like to call it non-social relatedness, but it is the same thing. It's just artificial characters you are related to, you feel related to, right? So competence, you show people, actually for the competence factor in marketing, the original Dark Souls game is a really good example. Do you maybe remember, have you played Dark Souls by any chance, Andrew?
I have not. And I probably won't after I played Bloodborne. But that's just me. But anyway, sorry.
All right. I actually played even Demon Souls, the very first Demon Souls. I played Dark Souls before it was cool. if I may say. I'm very humble, I know. So Dark Souls, the marketing campaign for the first Dark Souls game, it was like Prepare to Die. There was even the special edition was called the Prepare to Die edition. That was focusing on competence. That was focusing on that audience who loves the thrill, who loves to feel competent by, defeating a difficult boss and so on. That's how you can implement the competence focus in your marketing campaign, for example. Same with autonomy. We didn't talk about autonomy, and I don't want to go too much into detail. We don't have so much time. Autonomy, just to make it short, is significant decision making. You want to make impactful decisions in your life. You want to feel like that you can make decisions and that these have impact. And these are games like Heavy Rain, Detroit, and the Telltale series games, the Walking Dead, for example, Telltale series, and so on. They tell you the characters in this game may die, and the game will keep going. And this is all based on your decisions, the decisions you're making. Mass Effect, the same. Whole Mass Effect campaign was built around all the big decisions you're making and what kind of impact it has on the game world. That is autonomy, for example. And also, you could also say, just to go away from these decision-making games, all kind of card battle games. You make so much decisions on which kind of decks you should choose and so on. And just showing this off in your trailers and making this clear to the audiences, this is something highly, highly engaging, obviously. That is for marketing materials, for the creatives, basically, and so on. You can focus on aspects you can focus on. On the other hand, obviously, things like Discord servers, building the community, giving them something like a common goal, like that, all that, being fans, giving them the opportunity to be fans together as a group. This is all also really, really important stuff these days. And don't underestimate TikTok. TikTok these days, you can get so much free marketing out there, especially for indie developers. Indie developers out there, please go to TikTok. Just put some stuff from your development in there. People will love that. And especially if it's some crazy, some viral stuff with viral potential. I have some content on viral potential as well on YouTube. If you want to check that out, that might be helpful for you to create these viral TikTok videos, even though my own TikTok videos are just not viral yet.
Well,
Oh
I just want to cover some things real quick, what you said there, because excuse me, when we talk, folks, about, you know, general awareness and how else these things apply, especially from the behavior and psychology point, what I did was there was 3 key things that Patrick said, and I made note of them. So it was like relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And just to make it even a little bit more clear, or at least giving other examples of what we might also call this, these are actually some things I may call it. So relatedness, that could, some words I like to use when I'm talking to people about these things is, you know, connection, or how are you resonating with people, and attention. And basically this boils down to, these are all emotional characteristics from like a more social point of view. These are all things that we as people try to look for. How do we connect with other people? How do we find our other tribe members and things like that? So it's more of an emotional one of these things. And then when you get to competence, I mean, I love that example, Patrick, because essentially that competence, it's also, and of course with games like, you know, Dark Souls and anything, honestly, from software, we're talking about challenge components. What's that challenge? And if you really boil that down into a more emotional element, we're talking about survival, but not in the sense of like a typical like survival game, but more of like, it's like that reptilian main intrinsic thing that we all have inside of us, some way, shape, or form. Just some it's more prominent than others. And then the autonomy. I mean, another way we might describe this is like player agency, the ability of choices. But again, ultimately, this comes down to control. We all, to some degree, like some level of control in our lives. And sometimes it's harder for people to recognize that on a personal level or not. But then if it's something where that's a very, very important factor, and you're not as laid back, let's say, just as maybe one example, if you're playing a game that gives you that level of control, how much more empowering is that? So these are all little things that, like Patrick shared with us, which I think is great, that can boil down into psychology, emotions, like all these things. And again, great examples of, hey, if you apply it to your trailer, if you apply it to your messaging or whatever else. And to wrap it all up, you said, but make it clear. Because we're talking, again, these are potentially some getting into complex stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And again, you don't want to make it complex. You want to make it clear. You want to try to make it as simple as possible. And once you can start doing these things, then it's like, then you get the people to actually like, wow, to resonate with you or to relate with what you're putting out there, to get that competence, to the autonomy aspect. So again, I just love that you shared those things, because it's a process. There's some thinking involved, but once you start thinking about it more often and then you make it clear, that's when like people start connecting the dots and making it an overall great experience, from the time they see your game from awareness down and all the way down to the other stuff we talked about in game, where everybody is having this really awesome experience from the moment that you saw your trailer or whatever else, all the way down to playing that game. So absolutely love that you share that, and just such a great way to kind of like close here. But before we do, there's one, we have a special announcement to make in a moment. But first, we covered a ton today. And in light of that, what are some like tips, suggestions, advice that you have for our listeners based off of our conversation today?
All right. Something I do when I design my games. I don't design games very often myself anymore these days, I must say that, but I help my clients to design their games and their features, right? Focus on intrinsic motivation. Understand what that is. I love to use the 3 factors we talked about now, and that was a great summary. Thanks for that, Andrew. Focus on the intrinsic motivation. And one thing I didn't say yet, I want to add this very quick. Avoid extrinsic incentives, because these can undermine the intrinsic motivation of players. What does it mean? For example, external rewards. In our jobs, that is money. This is why creative people, for example, don't like to be creative anymore after some time when they work for money, because when the money is gone, the motivation is gone as well. The intrinsic motivation is gone. That is called the over-justification effect in psychology. I know it was supposed to be short. I'm sorry, Andrew.
It's okay.
But it's a really important one. And you see that in free-to-play games, login bonuses. Login bonuses, they seem to work at first. Extrinsic motivation is also motivation, but they undermine the intrinsic factors, the fun, the passion, the reason why we initially played games. The reason why often games these days don't feel anymore like in our childhood is just that thing, because the games reward us too much with, for example, trophies and on PlayStation, or gamer score, or some kind of achievements, or login bonuses and stuff. This is one of the main reasons why games don't feel anymore like in our childhood. Okay, sorry. That was a very long point. Second one, which I think is really important, that one is a little shorter, is, well, the strongest and most engaging game features are worthless if your players can't access them. So that is the accessibility. So all that motivation stuff, it's absolutely worthless if your player can't get to play the game because they are too busy, they don't have the time for your game, or it's just too expensive to play, or whatever, right? Accessibility is the key to that. That opens the door to all that motivation and is extremely underrated. And by the way, if you want to have a really, really innovative game, try to focus on accessibility. That can already be a strong factor if it comes to innovation, and heavily underestimated. Third thing, measuring. Now, this is a little less fluffy than the stuff we talked about before, a bit more practical. But if you want to improve your retention, you also have to measure what your retention is right now. And you have to set yourselves goals. What do you want to improve in your game? So retention and engagement metrics are key to understand where your players drop out. And your data often lead to more useful conclusions than just asking the audience. And this is also really important. Of course, talking to the audience, knowing them is a good idea, but don't fall into that trap asking them too much, because a lot of their input is not as useful as you might think at first. It is useful. Don't underestimate it either. But it kind of leads you to wrong conclusions because, and I hate to say that myself, but players often don't know what they want. They don't understand their own psychology. When you understand the psychology of your game and your game data, that is often more powerful than just the opinion of your users.
Yeah, and that last one is so important because so many times we may just be like, oh, we'll just have it play tested and go with that. And, mind you're going to make, I think most people understand you can't just take everything players say verbatim, but I think by posing that, by digging in a little bit further, and even if you're at the point where you're not at that point yet, where you have those tools or access to those tools too, looking at from their own perspective, but as if you're playing it for the first time, these are all going to be other informative and even data points essentially that can help that and then better align with what you're seeing and then what players are seeing, and then kind of being able to filter out what's absolutely essential for the process. So love that too, because I think sometimes we just get caught in the trap of, oh, we'll just rely on play testers and they'll give us everything. And regardless if that's 10 to 100, there could be some components that we're missing, even if you have a good data set from that too. So I love that you shared that too. Well, we're definitely on time now, but this is such a great and insightful conversation. But before you drop us some links and means to connect with you, I just need to share with everybody that Patrick was so kind to give us a, let's just call it an early discount offer for some courses that he is currently, they're not out yet, but he's in the process of developing. They'll be out relatively soon. He can share some more details on that. And basically, if you mail Patrick, which is mail@patrickrose.io, yes, this will be in the show notes, folks. And the subject line, indie game movement discount. What he'll do is he'll put you on a list. You will get a substantial discount when these courses go live. And there's no commitment, no obligation. You don't have to pay anything. You're just going to be on a list. And when these come out, he'll give you more details there. But anything else you'd like to add to that? Because I think this is very valuable. You gave some insight in terms of what that discount would be, and I'll let you share what you want, but it's a pretty significant one. And I mean, based off of our conversation today, I can't imagine, why you wouldn't at least entertain the idea of this, because if you thought this was valuable today, folks, I can only imagine what those courses are going to be like. But Patrick, please share some quick additional details about these courses you got in the works.
Yes, exactly. So the things we talked about that will be part of that course as well, just since it's a pretty complex topic. I want to give it a lot of time in this course so you will understand with a lot of game examples from all kind of business models, premium to free to play, on mobile platforms, in hyper casual, in premium games, all of these game examples. So you will really understand and master how to use how to use the human intrinsic motivation to make your game successful. On top of that, we will also talk about extrinsic factors of motivation and the over-justification effect I mentioned. And since this engagement part and retention part is only one pillar of success of your game, we will also talk about other pillars, and that is monetization, how to create a powerful monetization system for your service game, for example. We will also talk about premium games a little bit, and the topic accessibility and how to use it to be super innovative with your game design will also be a big topic of that. And that is basically it. So the full program to make a successful game. And the prices are not out yet. We have not decided yet. It will not be cheap, I must say that. But for you, it will be much cheaper than for anyone else. And I promise you at least a 50% discount if you write me. And again, it's no commitment just yet. You can still decide later if you want it. But if you write me now, then I'll put you on my list. And this offer stands until the end of June of this year, 2024.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, can't thank you enough. And folks, again, if you were remotely interested in what we discussed, what Patrick shared with us today, then I can't think of why you wouldn't at least take advantage of simply being notified. So thank you again, Patrick, for, sharing and that with our audience today, and such a generous discount as well too, once that's live. And, but in the meantime, if people want to find out more about you, want to connect, Anything else? Because I know you have some really good content that's starting that you're starting to ramp up on YouTube. What are some ways people can connect with you? Please give us some links.
Yeah, sure. So feel free to contact me through my link tree. You will have that one. And then I also have the YouTube and the TikTok and Instagram account. YouTube is probably the most interesting thing for most of you, since I put some interesting free content pieces there. I'm not a professional content creator just yet, but I'm getting better at it. And it's in the early stages. If you want to follow me now, I would really appreciate it.
All right, cool. Well, hey, folks, I mean, as I'm sure a lot of you know, getting started with anything, regardless of your past experience, can always be, a bit of a challenge at first, but it just takes some time to get the momentum. So if you want, again, in the show notes, you'll get Patrick's link tree, has all of his links there. He's on LinkedIn. The big one where he's getting a lot more of that content, and if you could follow, would be on YouTube. But again, check out the show notes for those links, because they're all just variations of your name essentially, but they differ a little bit, which is why we're not. But essentially, Patrick Rose, if you look him up on anything, I'm sure you'll probably find him. But the show notes are probably going to be the best place to start. So again, thanks for the offer. Thanks for your time today. And again, just all this valuable insight. Just really appreciate what you shared with us. And it was great having you here on the show today.
I thank you so much for having me, and also for all your attention. I know these are complex topics. It's not easy to listen to me for one entire hour. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.